He was the sword of France, the loyal knight who fought beside Joan of Arc and helped crown a king. The nation celebrated him as a living saint. But behind the high walls of his castle, a darker truth festered. When the cheering of the crowds faded, the only sounds from his dungeons were the screams of children, their bodies offered in blood rituals to summon the devil. This is the story of how France's greatest hero became its most vile monster, or was he? In the year of our Lord 1440, as autumn bled its dying colors across the lands of Brittany, a whisper took root. It was a thing of no substance, colder than the north wind that stripped the leaves from the boughs and moaned through the thatches of peasant hovels. This was not a sound born on the field of battle, where the clang of steel was a familiar and almost comforting music, but in the suffocating quiet of the villages, in the gloom of hearths where the fires burned low and every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe. The whisper was of children. Of children who were there one moment and gone the next, plucked from the world as cleanly as a falcon takes a dove from the air. It began with a single boy, a shepherd's son who had followed a stray lamb into the woods and never returned. Then a girl, taken from her own doorstep while her mother turned her back for only a moment to stir the pot. Soon, the count grew to a dozen, then scores, an invisible reaping that left no clues, offered no reason, and respected no boundary. At first, they sought familiar monsters. It was the wolves, they murmured, their hunger sharpened by the coming chill. Or perhaps it was the gens de la forêt, the old ones who dwelled deep within the tangled woods and did not forgive the bite of the axe. Offerings of bread and salt were left at lonely crossroads, and extra prayers were hastily whispered in the parish church. Men armed themselves with pitchforks and scythes, venturing into the ancient forests in search of some tangible beast to blame. They found nothing. No tracks larger than a deer's, no tattered scraps of clothing caught on thorn bushes, no signs of a struggle in the damp earth. The woods were unnervingly silent, holding their secrets close. The men returned to their villages with their shoulders slumped, their faces etched with a new kind of fear. The dread of a wolf is a simple thing, the dread of an unseen, unknowable predator is a cancer that consumes the soul. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. The fear changed then, turning inward, poisoning the very air between neighbors. Laughter, once the lifeblood of the villages, was stifled, dying in the throat. Mothers clutched their babes tighter, barring their doors long before the sun had dipped below the horizon. Every unfamiliar traveler was met with suspicious eyes, every creak of a floorboard in the night sent hearts hammering against ribs. A shared, unspoken terror settled over the land, a certainty that this was not the work of any beast, but of a calculated, human evil. This was a new kind of darkness for a land that had just begun to hope. The Great War, the conflict that had torn at the heart of France for nearly 100 years, was finally turning. The memory of the Maid, of Joan, was still a fresh and holy wound, a symbol of divine intervention and miraculous victory. They had seen a peasant girl lead armies and crown a king. They had believed, for a fleeting time, that the age of monsters was over and the age of heroes had returned to the world. And there was no greater hero in the living memory of the common men than the one whose lands these were. A name that shone with the reflected glory of the Maid herself. He was the Marshal of France, a scion of the noblest houses of Brittany and Anjou, a warrior whose courage at the siege of Orleans was the stuff of legend. A man of immense wealth, culture, and power, whose favor with King Charles VII was absolute. A man whose gleaming armor had been a beacon of hope on the battlefield. Slowly, cautiously, the whisper gained a name. It was a name spoken only in the deepest shadows of the tavern, in the terrified hush of a bedtime confession between husband and wife. It felt like a blasphemy on the tongue, a sin to even think it. To connect that celebrated name with the stolen children, with the unspeakable acts that must have befallen them, seemed a madness. Yet, the whispers persisted, slithering from one village to the next like a pestilence. For the shadow of his many castles, especially the dark and forbidding fortress of Tiffogs, fell long across these lands. The Marshal had retired from the royal court some years ago, following the capture and execution of the Maid. He had retreated behind his high stone walls, and strange stories had begun to seep out, tales of lavish theatrical productions, of alchemists and sorcerers from distant lands, and of a spending so prodigious it beggared belief. The peasants worked his fields and paid him their tithes. They had seen his retinue ride by, a river of silk and steel. His power was as tangible as the earth beneath their feet. And so the horrifying logic began to take hold in their minds. Who but a lord of such immense power could make children disappear without a trace? Who else could act with such impunity, silencing any who might dare to ask questions? Who else could command such perfect, terrifying secrecy? The two images refused to reconcile, the savior of France, the pious and brave companion in arms to a saint, and the ravenous, child-stealing monster of their nightmares. Yet, as autumn deepened and more children vanished, the whispers grew bolder. The name was spoken more frequently, a venomous secret shared by a people gripped in the jaws of a terror they could not comprehend. It was the shadow of the hero, the Marshal of France, Gilles de Rais. To even conceive of such a thing was a form of madness. The name Gilles de Rais was not one to be whispered in connection with darkness and depravity, it was a name to be proclaimed by heralds, to be sung by troubadours. It was a name synonymous with the salvation of France, a golden thread woven into the very fabric of the nation's improbable resurrection. The whispers from the villages were the ravings of frightened peasants, surely, for the man they accused was less a man and more a living monument to honor. He was born from the oldest and most powerful bloodlines. A scion of the great houses of Montmorency, Laval and Craon, his pedigree was a litany of heroes and power brokers. From his earliest youth, he was marked for greatness, a prodigy in the arts of both war and court. He mastered the lance and the sword before other boys had laid aside their wooden toys. He was possessed of a fierce intelligence, a charismatic presence, and a fortune so vast it was spoken of with the same awe reserved for the royal treasury itself. His early campaigns were a testament to his innate martial genius. He moved on the battlefield with the deadly grace of a hawk, his mind a razor-sharp instrument of tactics and strategy. He earned his spurs not through privilege but through blood and courage, his banner a familiar sight in the vanguard of every desperate charge. He was the embodiment of chivalry, the shining knight from the romances made real, and his reputation for valor was exceeded only by his reputation for unwavering piety. Then came the girl. The maid from Domremy. When Joan arrived at the court of the Dauphin Charles at Chinon, a strange, burning star in the darkest night of France, many of the great lords met her with scorn and suspicion. They saw a peasant upstart, a deluded child. But Gilles de Rais saw a miracle. He saw the divine hand of God reaching down to smite the English invaders. He pledged himself to her cause without reservation, his immense wealth and military acumen laid at her feet. Their journey together became the stuff of legend. At the siege of Orleans, where the fate of France hung by a thread, he fought at her side like a guardian lion. His gleaming armor was a beacon of hope next to the stark white of her banner. While she inspired the demoralized troops with her celestial visions, he marshaled them with tactical brilliance, turning the tide in a series of audacious assaults. The soldiers came to see them as two halves of a holy weapon, the saint and her sword. He was there when the English were driven from the Loire Valley, a whirlwind of righteous fury on the battlefield. And he was there for the glorious culmination of their campaign, the coronation of the Dauphin as King Charles VII at Reims Cathedral. On that hallowed day, Gilles de Rais stood as one of the chosen few, a place of supreme honor, watching as the holy oil anointed the men he had helped make a king. This was the apex of his life, the moment when his destiny, and the destiny of France, seemed forged in heaven. For his service, for his unwavering loyalty and his battlefield prowess, a grateful king bestowed upon him the highest military honor in the land. At the age of just 25, Gilles de Rais was made Marshal of France. It was an unprecedented appointment for one so young, a recognition of a greatness that seemed boundless. His wealth was incalculable, his power immense, and his castles, particularly the brooding and magnificent fortress of Tiffauges, were symbols of his unassailable station. But the light that had guided him, the divine fire that had given his life purpose, was brutally extinguished in the year of our Lord 1431. The news of Joan's capture, trial, and execution at the hands of the English and their Burgundian allies reached him like a physical blow. It was an impossibility, a sacrilege that the heavens themselves should have prevented. The world, which had briefly seemed so clear and divinely ordered, was suddenly rendered meaningless. A profound and terrible change began within the marshal's soul. The pious certainty that had animated him curdled into a bitter, questioning despair. He had seen a miracle, and then he had seen that miracle betrayed and burned, while the king she had crowned did nothing. He saw the craven politics of men triumph over the will of God, and the foundation of his world crumbled to dust. The hero's fire in his eyes began to die, replaced by a cold and searching emptiness. He withdrew from the royal court, abandoning the world of politics and war that had once been his entire existence. The gleaming armor was put away, the war horse stabled. He retreated to his vast estates in Brittany, sealing himself behind the formidable walls of his many castles. He sought solace not in prayer, but in a frantic and hedonistic extravagance that shocked his peers. The hero of Orleans became a recluse, a patron of ever more bizarre and costly spectacles. His days were filled with a desperate search for distraction. He commissioned lavish theatrical plays with casts of hundreds, their costumes spun from gold thread and their stages groaning with elaborate machinery. He hosted feasts that lasted for days, where the rarest wines flowed like water and entire bestiaries were roasted for the pleasure of his guests. He surrounded himself with musicians and poets, hoping to drown out the silence left by the voice of God. But the emptiness remained, a gnawing abyss in the center of his being. The pageantry and excess were a fleeting balm, and the darkness always returned when the last guest had departed and the castle fell silent. His spending became legendary, a hemorrhage of gold that even his vast fortune could not sustain. He sold off lands and titles, borrowing ruinous sums to fund his increasingly manic pursuits, driven by a hunger that no earthly pleasure could satisfy. It was then that other, stranger figures began to appear at his gates. They were not knights or nobles, but men who dealt in secrets and shadows. Alchemists from Italy who promised the secret of turning lead into gold, a solution to his financial woes. Astrologers from the East who claimed to read the future in the stars. And darker still, men who spoke in hushed tones of ancient texts and forgotten rituals, who hinted at powers beyond the ken of the church. These men offered him a different kind of knowledge, a different path to power. They spoke of a world not governed by a silent and indifferent God, but by other forces, older and more transactional. Forces that could be summoned, bargained with, and commanded. Forces that could grant a man all that he desired, wealth, knowledge, and perhaps even a mastery over life and death itself. For a man whose faith had been shattered, these blasphemous promises were a seductive poison. He plunged into the study of the occult with the same obsessive energy he had once devoted to the art of war. The great library at Tifog's, once filled with chivalric romances and the lives of saints, now swelled with grimoires bound in human skin and scrolls penned in forgotten tongues. The lower chambers of the castle, the deep cellars and forgotten dungeons, were transformed into laboratories. The scent of incense and prayer was replaced by the acrid stench of sulfur and strange chemical concoctions. The whispers from the villages had found their source. The loyal servants within the castle walls saw things they could not understand. They saw their lord, the great marshal, locked for days on end with his foreign advisors. They heard strange chanting from behind barred doors, and saw fires burning in the laboratory furnaces at all hours of the night. The strange and lavish pursuits had become strange and frightening occupations, and a new, more sinister shadow had fallen over the hero of France. Behind the high, indifferent walls of Tifog's, the world of daylight and simple truths grew thin and faded. As the sun set, the castle did not surrender to darkness but instead gave birth to its own feverish, unnatural light. The glow from hundreds of tallow candles cast dancing, distorted shadows that writhed upon the cold stone, creating a silent theater of monstrous shapes. Here, in this self-imposed exile, Gilles de Rais had cultivated a court of shadows. He had become a connoisseur of obsession, drawing to him the occultists, the charlatans, and the true believers from across the continent. They were a motley collection of men with hungry eyes and whispered promises, drawn to the scent of his despair and the seemingly bottomless depth of his coffers. From Florence came a man named Francesco Prelati, a self-proclaimed master of demonic arts, whose charisma was as potent as any poison. He spoke not of failure, but of method. The spirits, he insisted, were not to be begged, but commanded. They required a key to open the door between worlds, a payment in a currency that was neither gold nor silver, but something far more precious. By day, the marshal was a scholar of damnation. He would sit for hours in his vast library, the air thick with the dust of centuries and the scent of decaying leather. He consumed the forbidden texts, his eyes tracing the arcane diagrams and the blasphemous incantations. He sought a rational system in the heart of madness, a cold, hard logic that would unlock the gates of hell itself. But when night fell, the intellectual pursuit gave way to a visceral one. He would descend into the castle's belly, to the network of cellars and dungeons that had been remade into alchemical laboratories. Here, the theories on the page were put to the test. The air was a suffocating cocktail of sulfur, mercury, and stranger, unnameable things. The heat from the furnaces was a constant, oppressive presence. At first, the goal had been gold. A frantic, desperate attempt to conjure wealth from base metals to stave off the ruin his extravagance had wrought. Alembics bubbled with foul-smelling concoctions, and astrological charts were consulted with religious precision. He sought the philosopher's stone, the mythical substance that could cure his financial ills and restore his standing. But every experiment ended in failure. The failure gnawed at him, feeding the emptiness that Joan's death had carved in his soul. Prelati and the others offered a new interpretation. The quest for gold was a fool's errand, a distraction from the true prize. The ancient text spoke of a greater power, not merely the ability to manipulate matter, but the power to command fate, to see beyond the veil of mortality, to compel the princes of the abyss to do one's bidding. This was the true seduction. If the God he had served could allow his chosen saint to be burned, then that God was either powerless or cruel. The alternative, then, was to seek power from the opposite source. To treat with the adversary. The goal shifted from alchemy to theurgy, from chemistry to conjuration. He no longer sought to create gold, but to command the demons who ruled the world's treasures. The work in the cellars took on a new and darker character. The bubbling alembics were joined by circles of salt inscribed with demonic sigils. The experiments now required more than minerals and acids. They required life. At first, it was animals, a black cockerel, a stray cat, a lamb. Gilles watched, his stomach churning with a mixture of revulsion and clinical fascination, as Prelati performed the rites. He held the grimoire, his voice steady as he recited the ancient, guttural words that felt like a sacrilege on his tongue. He watched the blood trace patterns on the floor and waited for a sign, a manifestation, a whisper from the other side. But the candles only flickered in the drafty cellar, and the blood merely cooled and congealed upon the stone. The silence that answered their calls was a mockery. Prelati was never discouraged. The failures were not failures, he explained, but merely lessons. The spirits were testing their resolve, their commitment. The life force of a simple beast was an insult to the great powers they sought to summon. A lock of such immense strength required a key of commensurate value. The greatest power, he would murmur, his eyes gleaming in the candlelight, required the greatest sacrifice. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but perfectly understood. Gilles felt a line being drawn, a final boundary between the world he knew and an abyss from which there could be no return. For weeks, he resisted, clinging to the last vestiges of the men he had once been, the knight who had fought for God and France. He would storm out of the laboratory, seeking refuge in his library, but the words in the ancient books echoed Prelati's whispers. They all spoke of the same thing. The power of innocent blood. The energy contained within a life prematurely ended, a soul untainted by the sins of the world. It was described in cold, academic terms, a necessary component in a dark and terrible equation. The scholar in him was intrigued by the horrifying logic, the monster that was growing within him was seduced by the promise. The financial ruin was now absolute. Creditors were circling, and the Duke of Brittany himself was casting a covetous eye on his remaining lands. The desperation became a physical agony, a tightening vice that squeezed out all reason, all morality. The whispers of Prelati and the promises of the grimoires became the only possible path. He had to know. He had to see if it was true. The decision, when it was finally made, was not a dramatic, thunderous event. It was a quiet, cold surrender in the dead of night, a weary nod of assent in the smoky laboratory. The scholar had laid out the theory, and the desperate man now demanded the experiment. The final barrier crumbled into dust. All that remained was to find the necessary component. The key. His most trusted servants, men whose loyalty had been bought with gold and fear, were summoned. They were men like Poitou and Henriette, hardened by years of service, their own souls long since mortgaged to their lord's will. The marshal did not have to give an explicit order. He spoke of a young boy, of a certain age and appearance, needed for a secret and important task within the castle. The request was understood. The hunt began. The whispers that had once clung to the deepest shadows now walked boldly in the open air, carried on the autumn wind from one market town to the next. They were no longer the fearful, isolated murmurs of a handful of bereaved families but a low, constant hum of grief and accusation that resonated across the whole of Brittany. The sheer number of the vanished had become an undeniable truth, a gaping wound on the landscape of the duchy that refused to heal and would not stop bleeding. Every parish, every village and hamlet that lay within a day's hard ride of the marshal's great castles, now had a story to add to the horrifying litany. A missing son who had gone to apprentice in a nearby town and never arrived, a daughter who had gone to the well to fetch water and was never seen again. The collective weight of these disappearances crushed the initial disbelief, collapsing all other explanations under the burden of its terrible consistency. The abstract horror now had a fixed and terrestrial location. All fingers, trembling with a mixture of righteous terror and impotent rage, now pointed in one direction, toward the grim, high towers of Tifog's and the other fortresses belonging to the marshal. This growing certainty drew an invisible line in the earth around his holdings. His servants and men-at-arms, once respected and feared as extensions of his noble power, were now met with stony silence in the marketplaces. In the taverns, men would turn their backs, and the women would pull their children close. The scattered pleas of peasants, which had for years been dismissed by local magistrates who were either in the marshal's pay or simply too awed by his power to act, began to find a different path. Desperate parents, having lost all faith in the temporal justice of lords and reeves, turned to the only other authority they knew, an authority that claimed its power from God himself. They carried their impossible stories to the priests in the sanctity of the confessional, and the tales began to flow. Like streams joining a river, these accounts moved upward through the intricate arteries of the Holy Church. From parish priests to their deans, the horrifying reports traveled, finally reaching the heart of the diocese in the great city of Nantes. There, they landed upon the desk of Gilles de Malestroit, the Bishop of Nantes. He was a man of stern and unbending faith, but also a shrewd political mind, not one to be swayed by the hysterical gossip of the common folk. But the volume and the chilling consistency of the reports that reached him were impossible to ignore. These were not the wild tales of wolves or the fey folk that peasants used to explain the harsh realities of the world. These were meticulous, grounded accounts of children being lured away by well-dressed men, of last sightings on roads leading inexorably toward one of the marshal's estates, of servants from his household making inquiries about comely youths in distant villages. The bishop, deeply troubled, began his own discreet investigation, dispatching his most trusted clerics to the afflicted regions. They were not to announce their purpose, but to listen, to record, and to assess the credibility of the claims. The clerics returned weeks later, their faces pale with a shared shock, their journals filled with the testimonies of dozens upon dozens of families. The stories, gathered independently over 100 miles, were horrifyingly similar, weaving a tapestry of loss that covered the better part of a decade. For Bishop de Malestroit, the truth was now laid bare, and its implications horrified him to his very core. This was not merely the sordid crime of a depraved nobleman indulging a secret vice. The other whispers that had reached him, the rumors of Italian sorcerers, of alchemy and demonology, suggested a far deeper spiritual sickness. This was a rot that threatened the soul of his entire flock, a heresy of the most profound and abominable nature. He understood the danger immediately. To openly challenge a marshal of France, a celebrated hero of the realm and a man with powerful friends at court, was to invite a political and ecclesiastical storm that could easily destroy him. But to remain silent, to know of this evil and do nothing, was to become complicit in damnation. It was a failure of his sacred duty before God. His choice was clear. He chose his weapon with great care. It would not be a formal, written accusation sent to the Duke, which could be buried in politics and legal maneuvering. It would be a sermon, delivered from the heart of his power, the great cathedral of Saint Pierre and Saint Paul in Nantes. The air within the cathedral that Sunday was thick with an unspoken anxiety. The bishop's disquiet had become the subject of intense rumor, and the space was filled to capacity, from the wealthiest merchants to the humblest artisans. Gilles de Malestroit ascended the stone pulpit, his face a mask of grim resolve, the weight of his knowledge pressing down upon him. He began not with fire and brimstone, but with a deep and resonant sorrow, speaking of the sacred duty of the powerful to protect the weak, of the shepherd's holy trust to guard his flock from all predators. His voice, clear and strong, filled the vaulted space, each word a carefully placed stone building the foundation of his argument. Then, his tone shifted, hardening with the cold fire of righteous anger. He spoke of a great wolf that had entered the fold, a lord of noble birth, blessed by both God and king with immense wealth and the highest of honors, who had turned his back on his creator and his responsibilities. He spoke of a man whose despair and arrogance had led him to seek forbidden knowledge in the darkest of places, turning his ancestral home into a temple of evil. Though he uttered no name, the meaning was as clear as the light filtering through the high stained glass windows. Every person in the cathedral knew of whom he spoke. He described unholy rites and blasphemous rituals, of pacts made with demons, sealed not with wax or with ink, but with the most precious and potent currency imaginable, the blood of innocent children. A collective gasp, a sound of shared and sudden horror, swept through the congregation. The unspeakable had been given a voice from the seat of God's authority. He concluded not with a call for the mob's vengeance, but with a solemn and chilling promise. He declared that the Church was the ultimate guardian of the innocent, the final shield against the darkness, and that it would not stand idle while such abominations were committed in its lands. He vowed to uncover the full truth, to follow the stench of this sin to its source, no matter the earthly power of the sinner. It was a formal declaration of war. As the shaken congregation spilled out into the autumn sunlight of the cathedral square, something had irrevocably changed in the Duchy of Brittany. The bishop's words had acted as a key, unlocking hundreds of private conversations, legitimizing years of suppressed fear and grief. The wall of terror that had surrounded the marshal, built from his prestige and his power, had been breached. The name that had been a fearful whisper was now spoken aloud, carried on a current of righteous outrage. The sermon became a fire that raced across the countryside, carried by merchants and pilgrims. It emboldened local priests to speak out from their own pulpits. It gave grieving parents the courage to voice their accusations openly, without fear of reprisal. The authority of the Holy Church had provided a shield for the powerless, and the individual streams of grief and suspicion had merged into a great flood of public condemnation that could no longer be ignored or contained. The hunt had begun. The firestorm ignited by the bishop's sermon caught, and in the month of September in the year of our Lord 1440, the secular arm finally acted. It was not a quiet summons but a formal show of force. The ducal guard, their steel helmets catching the pale autumn light, arrived before the great gates of Tifog's. Gilles de Rais, Baron of Retz, Marshal of France, was arrested. The news of his capture sent a shockwave across the kingdom. The trial that began in the city of Nantes was a spectacle of the highest order, a collision of powers that drew observers from across France. Two distinct courts were convened to pass their judgment, a grim legal machinery set in motion to deconstruct a legend. A civil tribunal, under the authority of the Duke of Brittany, was assembled for the earthly charges of abduction, sodomy, and murder. But alongside it, and holding the greater terror, an ecclesiastical court was convened. Presided over by the implacable Bishop de Malestroit himself, it would address the profound sins of heresy, apostasy, and demonolatry. The charges were read in the cold, echoing hall of the Château de la Tourneuve, each word a hammer blow against the legacy of the accused. The hero of Orleans stood accused of the abduction and murder of more than 100, perhaps 140, children. And he was charged with the ultimate transgression, summoning demons and making pacts with devils. At first, he was the very picture of aristocratic disdain. Dressed in fine silks and velvets, he stood before his accusers not as a humble prisoner, but as a superior being inconvenienced by the scurrying of ants. He sneered at the peasant witnesses, openly insulted the bishop, and declared the entire proceeding an illegal farce born of greed and political ambition. He refused to enter a plea, treating the court with a contempt so profound it bordered on madness. He claimed his ancient rights as a peer of the realm, subject only to the judgment of the king himself, not this provincial tribunal. His every word was a challenge, his posture a declaration that he was beyond their reach, a being of a higher order than those who sat in judgment of him. For days, his unshakable arrogance held the proceedings in a stalemate. He was an immovable object of noble pride, secure in the belief that his name and his past glories made him untouchable. He was not just a man, he was a symbol of France's victory, and he seemed to believe that to condemn him was to condemn France itself. But the ecclesiastical court possessed tools against which noble birth offered no shield. Seeing his unrepentant defiance, Bishop de Malestroit and the Inquisitor, Jean Blauen, played their final, terrible card. They threatened him with the ultimate spiritual sanction, excommunication. To be cast out from the body of the Church, a fate more terrifying than death. And they threatened him with the rack. It was not an idle threat. In the chilling quiet of the courtroom, the instruments of torture were described to him in meticulous, dispassionate detail. They were not angry, but procedural. They explained the mechanics of pain, the precise manner in which his body would be unmade, joint by joint, sinew by sinew. This was the key that unlocked his terror. The battlefield was a place of quick, honorable death. This was a promise of slow, methodical, physical deconstruction. In that moment, the abstract concept of pain became a concrete and imaginable reality. The Marshal of France, the peer of the realm, the hero, all vanished. He was reduced to a man of flesh and bone who was afraid to be broken. The defiant lord vanished, replaced by a pale, trembling man. The arrogance evaporated from his eyes, leaving behind only a raw and primal terror that he could no longer conceal. Before the court, before God and men, his will was finally and absolutely shattered. He agreed to swear the oath. He agreed to make a full and complete confession. What followed was not a reluctant admission of guilt, but a torrent of depravity that left the courtroom in a state of stunned, horrified silence. The scribes, whose hands were trained to record the driest of legal proceedings, found their fingers trembling. The judges and inquisitors, men who had heard every sin imaginable in the confessional, listened with faces of ashen disbelief. Gilles de Rais began to speak. His voice was a low, steady monotone, a horrifying calm that made the content of his words infinitely more obscene. He began by confirming the roles of his most trusted servants, his loyal instruments, Henriette and Poitou. He recounted with clinical precision how they would scout villages for beautiful children, luring them with promises of food or employment. He confessed to everything. The charges, he admitted, were not only true but were a pale and inadequate shadow of the reality. He spoke of the dungeons and the high chambers of Tiffogs, rooms he had transformed from places of imprisonment into private theaters of suffering. He described, with an unnerving and perfect memory for detail, the last moments of his victims. He spoke not as a penitent seeking forgiveness, but as an artist dispassionately reviewing his life's work. He described his morbid fascination with their fear, his perverse aesthetic pleasure in the color of their blood against the gray stone floors. He confessed to violating their bodies, to torturing them in ways that fulfilled the darkest passages of his forbidden books. All of it, he claimed, was in the service of the rituals. The offerings were meant to appease and compel the demons he sought to command, chief among them a being he called Baron. He had hoped their innocent souls, violently released from their bodies, would provide the key to unlock the gate between worlds, to grant him the knowledge and wealth he craved. But as he continued to speak, a more terrible truth emerged. The rituals themselves had become an excuse, a framework for a depravity that needed no higher purpose. The quest for gold and demonic knowledge had long ago been supplanted by a pure and insatiable lust for the act of killing itself. He admitted, in his flat and toneless voice, that he had derived a profound pleasure from their suffering. He told the court that the number of victims was not 100, as the charges suggested, but many times that. He had lost count long ago. He spoke of the bodies being burned to ash in the castle's great fireplaces, or dismembered and packed into chests to be hidden away. He had erased them so completely that only he remained as a witness to their existence and their end. He spoke for hours, the horrifying narrative pouring out of him in an unbroken, methodical stream. He left nothing out, sparing neither himself nor his listeners any grotesque detail. The hero of France had meticulously painted his own portrait for the court, and the image that emerged was not of a fallen man, but of a monster cloaked in the finery of a nobleman. When he finally fell silent, the great hall was utterly still. The 26th day of October, in the year of our Lord 1440, dawned grey and cold over the city of Nantes. A damp mist clung to the lawyer, shrouding the city in a funereal veil, as if nature itself was holding its breath, caught between the memory of a hero and the damnation of a monster. From the pre-dawn hours, a great crowd had been gathering in the meadow of Bise, a grim pilgrimage to witness the end of a legend. They came not with the raucous energy of a holiday fair, but with a somber, almost religious gravity. They were there to see justice, but also to stare into the face of an evil their minds could scarcely comprehend. The verdict had been absolute, the confession unforgettable. The man who was to be executed was no common murderer. He was the Marshal of France, a name that had once been a prayer on the lips of a desperate nation. Now it was a curse, a byword for a depravity so profound it felt like a tear in the fabric of the world. Shortly before noon, the procession began. At its center walked Gilles de Rais, flanked by his two loyal servants, Henriette and Poitou, who were to share his fate. The marshal was not the sneering, defiant aristocrat from the trial's early days. He was dressed in simple clothes, his face pale but composed, his eyes fixed on some distant, internal point. He had, in his final days, become a model of Christian penitence. He had wept before the bishop, begged forgiveness from the parents of his victims, and exhorted his accomplices to face their deaths with courage and faith in God's mercy. It was a transformation so complete that it was, in its own way, as unsettling as his crimes. As he walked toward the 3 gallows that had been erected, a hush fell over the massive crowd. They saw not a monster, but a man walking to his death with a dignity that seemed impossible, a composure that warred with the horrific images from his confession. The spectacle created a profound and disturbing dissonance in the hearts of all who watched. Before the scaffold, he turned and addressed the people of Nantes. His voice was not the roar of a warrior, but the quiet, steady tone of a man who had made his peace. He asked for their prayers, not for himself, but for his 2 servants. He spoke of his own sins as being so great that he was beyond forgiveness, yet he begged God to have mercy on his soul. Then came the end. As an act of mercy befitting his noble birth, he was not to be burned alive. The executioner placed the rope around his neck. The marshal closed his eyes, his lips moving in a silent prayer. There was a sickening crack, and the body of the hero of Orleans went limp, swinging gently in the autumn breeze. His 2 servants swiftly followed him into death. His body was cut down and carried to a great pyre that had been built nearby. It was laid upon the wood, a symbolic act of purification by fire. As the flames licked at the wood and began to consume the mortal remains of the marshal, a collective sigh, a release of pent-up tension, passed through the crowd. It was a sound of horror, of righteous anger, and of a deep, sorrowful confusion. The smoke that rose into the gray sky carried with it the end of an era. The land had been purged of its monster. The whispers were silenced, the fear abated. Justice, terrible and absolute, had been done. The church had protected its flock, the duke had cleansed his lands, and the name of Gilles de Rais was now officially and eternally sealed in the annals of evil. In the weeks that followed, the duke's men swarmed the marshal's castles, most notably the dark fortress of Tiffauges. They were armed with shovels and pickaxes, expecting to unearth a charnel house. They searched for the evidence that would corroborate the horrifying confession, for the physical proof of the dozens upon dozens of murders. They searched the cellars and the dungeons. They tapped the flagstones for hollow spaces and tore down walls. They sifted the cold ashes from the great fireplaces. They found the alchemical laboratories, filled with strange instruments and esoteric charts. They found the magnificent library, with its forbidden books. But they found no bodies. Not a single human bone, not a shred of a child's clothing, not one trace of the mass slaughter described in the confession was ever unearthed. The castles were silent, yielding no secrets. The only evidence that the crimes had ever happened were the words that had been spoken by the marshal himself, under the shadow of the rack. 2 years passed. The story of Gilles de Rais had already hardened into legend, a cautionary tale told by fireplaces across the kingdom. He was the shining knight who had fallen into darkness, the ultimate proof that the devil walked among men. His lands had been seized, his wealth distributed among his powerful creditors, chief among them the Duke of Brittany, Jean V. Then, from the royal court, came a decree that was as shocking as the original crimes. King Charles VII, the very king whom Gilles de Rais had helped crown at Reims, issued a formal statement. He declared that his late marshal had been the victim of a miscarriage of justice, condemned and executed without sufficient proof by a hostile court. The king's declaration fractured the official certainty of the case. Suddenly, the entire narrative was thrown into question. Why would a king posthumously defend a man who had confessed to being a monstrous serial killer and heretic? The answer, as always, lay in the realm of power and politics. The trial had been a collaboration between the Church and the Duke of Brittany, 2 powers the king was keen to keep in check. With the king's words, the disturbing inconsistencies of the case came rushing back into the light. The complete lack of physical evidence. The fact that the marshal's vast fortune and lands had been immediately consumed by his chief accusers. And above all, the confession, the very pillar upon which the entire verdict rested. That confession had been extracted under the explicit and detailed threat of torture. Could a man, even a hero, be expected to maintain his innocence when faced with the methodical promise of being physically unmade? The words he had spoken, that torrent of depravity, could they have been a desperate fabrication, a performance of monstrousness given to a court that demanded nothing less? And so, 2 irreconcilable portraits remained, suspended forever in the amber of history. There was Gilles de Rais the hero, the pious and brave companion to a saint, who became the victim of a monstrous conspiracy, his wealth and power making him a target for the greedy and ambitious. A man who was broken on the wheel of political intrigue and ecclesiastical power. And there was Gilles de Rais the fiend, the monster of Tifogs. A man whose soul was shattered by the death of his idol, Joan of Arc, leading him down a path of despair, occultism, and ultimately, unimaginable evil. A man whose confession was the plain and simple truth, his crime so perfectly executed that he left no trace behind. The truth, whatever it had been, was lost to the smoke of the pyre. Only the monstrous story survived, too terrible and too compelling to be undone by a king's decree. The shining night was forgotten, and the name of Gilles de Rais was written over, forever inscribed in history not with the ink of provable fact, but with the blood of a terrifying and immortal legend.